Hello and welcome to 168 Hours Studio. My name is Soren Sargsyan. I'm the director of the Armenian Center for American Studies. My colleague is Mr. Artur Khachikyan, professor from Stanford University, and our distinguished guest today, Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, who was invited to Yerevan by us to talk to us and to present his views about the future of the world. Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, welcome to Armenia.
Professor Sachs, thank you so much for giving us a little bit more of your time.
It's
I
a
promise
pleasure.
this is not going to take much more than this. So this morning we received some pretty alarming news. Apparently the U.S. administration has given its okay to launch missile strikes deep into Russian territory, and England and France followed suit. We were all hoping for the era of peace. You know, President Trump said that once I come to power, I will end this war in 24 hours. But now it seems like events have taken a sudden turn for the worse. What consequences do you think this might have? I mean, probably not exactly the result we were hoping for.
Well, the Biden administration is in its last weeks. I don't think that the decision today, reckless as it is in my view, will change anything about the incoming Trump administration plans. This idea of striking deep inside Russia is an idea that Biden rejected just a few weeks ago. He rejected it on the advice of the Pentagon, which said it is dangerous, it is provocative, and it won't change the course of the war. Nothing from then till now has changed. Biden, however, is an old man. He's not very alert. There are people around him who are extreme hardliners. I don't really know whether he personally made this decision or whether it's Sullivan or Blinken or people whose names we don't even know in the deep state. But whatever the reason, this is a terrible decision because it just brings us a step closer to nuclear war, which we don't want to be anywhere close to. It won't change the outcome of the Ukraine war. It was rejected just a couple of weeks ago, and an administration that has been voted out of office should not do such provocative things. Again, we know that our president is doddering. He's an old man. He's not alert. And the administration and the people around him should not be taking these irresponsible actions. My own view, my own hope, is that whatever happens between now and January 20th, and I hope not much, that President Putin takes a deep breath, President Trump takes a deep breath, and that the day that Trump is in power, then they really have that phone call to say, let's stop this war. The United States has to say one magic sentence: NATO will not expand to Ukraine. On that basis, President Putin will say, we will stop fighting. The rest is details. And that's what I count on happening when Trump is in office. At least I hope so. One's never sure about these matters. But Biden has been one of the worst presidents we've had. This last decision is consistent with his being a terrible president, inconsequent, constantly changing positions, not even necessarily in control. And I'm hoping that Trump will change this.
Professor Sachs, you mentioned that Putin and Trump might try to end this war, and I certainly hope that they do. There's a horrific casualty numbers that we're hearing. And the U.S. might promise that NATO would not expand. Well, 2 days ago you were quoting somebody else who was saying that NATO would not expand. 30 years ago, perhaps?
Yes.
I think it was Hans Dietrich Genscher
Yes.
and James Baker, right? The famous thing, we will not expand 1 inch to the east. And now some people are saying this never happened. So would Putin be wise to believe just a promise, another promise, or do you think there will be some guarantees required or some kind of an agreement signed, formal agreement, guaranteeing the neutrality of Ukraine? But, you know, we had neutral Sweden, we had neutral Finland, they're not neutral anymore. And Austria, from what I understand, there is some sentiment, some people, or maybe it's being stirred up, not to be neutral anymore. So what guarantees would there be?
Well, it's very important to understand that World War II never ended with a treaty. And I think the United States was to blame. The reason it never ended with a treaty is that the Soviet Union said Germany killed 27 million of our people. We want Germany to be disarmed and neutral. And of course, Germany itself was divided into occupation zones as of the end of the war in 1945. The U.S. immediately came to the view in the summer of 1945, well, the next war will be with the Soviet Union. So rather than making a peace agreement to end World War II, the U.S. and the British and the French occupation zones merged, formed the Federal Republic of Germany, and rearmed Germany. And by the way, fact is, put a lot of former Nazis back in charge of leading armaments industries. And a few years later, Germany joined NATO. And this was, of course, for the Soviet Union, both an affront and a threat. And NATO was never viewed as a defensive force. What the Soviet Union viewed NATO as was the next front in a continuing Western war against the Soviet Union. There were periods of détente, for example, with Nixon, interestingly. There were periods of tension, but there was never an end to World War II on the basis of a treaty. When Mikhail Gorbachev said, I want to end the Cold War, and be sure he ended the Cold War, and he ended it peacefully, and this needs to be remembered. It wasn't an American victory. Mikhail Gorbachev said, I want the walls to come down. Of course, Reagan peacefully wanted to do that together with Gorbachev, but this was Gorbachev's initiative. I watched a lot of it firsthand, close up in Central and Eastern Europe as an economic advisor at the heads of governments that were involved in this. There arose immediately the question of German reunification. And in that context, there needed to be an agreement between the West and the Soviet Union for the legal end of the occupation of Germany. So German reunification was a legal event that was essentially the end of World War II. You needed the Soviet assent. And what did the United States and Germany say to the Soviet Union to get that assent? It was not ambiguous. It was not unclear. They said, without any equivocation, we will have German reunification and NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. And those are the words used by U.S. Secretary of State James Baker III directly to Mikhail Gorbachev on February 9th, 1990. And Hans-Dietrich Genscher is on a tape. You can listen. He says, when we say it won't move, we don't just mean within Germany. We mean anywhere to the east. It's so clear. Of course, America cheats. Please understand this. America is a big power. It cheats. It tries to do what it can do. It uses media, propaganda to get away with cheating. That's what big powers do, have no question. So a few years later, the United States, oh, we never promised that. You just read it in the documentation. You can find it online in something called the National Security Archive of George Washington University. It's all absolutely available online to read these documents, to watch these tapes. So the U.S. in 1994, under Bill Clinton, cheated. They adopted a plan. NATO will expand eastward. And by the way, not just eastward, maybe 100 kilometers or 300 kilometers, but keep going east, all the way to Ukraine, all the way to Georgia, remember. And they wanted to even go beyond. I'm sure that some crazy person in the United States said, why not Kazakhstan? Why not Uzbekistan?
Why not Armenia?
Why not Armenia? Of course. Their idea in 1990, I know it, was we won. Especially, by the way, in December 1991, the Soviet Union ended. And the American strategists, if you can call them that. It's a kind of euphemism because they hardly are good at strategy. But the American strategists said, we're alone. We're the most powerful country in the history of the world. We're more powerful than the Roman Empire. We're the world's sole superpower. We can do whatever we want. So that was the mindset. And cheating goes along with that mindset, the arrogance of power. So, to make a long story short, yes, the United States started to expand. Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of these strategists, explained in 1997 in his book, The Grand Chessboard, very clearly in a chapter, very meticulously laid out why Russia would be unable to resist. Because he asked the question, what if the US pushes NATO? What if Europe keeps expanding eastward, crowds Russia, surrounds Russia? What can Russia do? And Brzezinski asked the question, well, could it resist, or will it have to give in? And he reaches the conclusion, Russia will have no choice. He reaches the conclusion, for example, Russia will never form an alliance with China. He reaches the conclusion, Russia will never form an alliance with Iran. You know, okay, theorists, this is playing games. He compared the world to a chessboard. By the way, the world is not a chessboard. It's not a poker game. It's real lives of 8 billion people. American strategists are trained in game theory, which by itself, in its name, gives everything away. They treat the world as a game. Bluff, raise, call, as if it's a poker game. And you know what? They use other people's lives to do it. They raise the stakes with Putin. We raise you. But whose lives were they betting on the table? The Ukrainian lives. Not a good show.
Being where we are today, on the brink of a possible nuclear conflict, which some people are saying, when you speak about it, it's Putin's argument, it's Putin's bluff, we're going to call this bluff, which is incredibly dangerous in my opinion. What would it take for the world leaders to reject this model of domination and go back to the model of equilibrium and balance and mutual respect and restraint? Because you were talking about children, thinking about our children's future. I mean, we are now at a point where we have to be very careful, or we will not be able to hold our children anymore, because you can't hold something that's not there.
Yep,
I mean, what would it take?
I had a recent discussion with John Mearsheimer about these issues, and first of all, he's a very good friend, and he's a wonderful person and a wonderful scholar. And we agree on 2 out of the 3 hotspot zones. We agree on Ukraine, that this war was provoked by the US and has to end. We agree on the Middle East, that this war was provoked by the Israel lobby and it needs to end. We disagree on China. By the way, not because he says China's evil, just because he says that great powers get into conflict with each other. Now, that's called realism in academia,
yes.
But there are different variants of realism, and one kind of realism says that it is realistic for great powers to be able to find a peaceful accommodation of each other, that's realistic. And there's another kind of realism that is part of our nuclear age, and that realism says that nuclear weapons changed what realism is, because old realism was, well, you had some wars, but that was okay, not the best. It was a reality. But the new realism is we can't afford a war between nuclear powers, because that would end humanity, not to mention the 2 competing powers, so that there can't be a winner in a nuclear scenario. And I take both the idea that realism includes mutual accommodation and the idea that the nuclear age is different from all past history. We have to be all the more careful. If Russia says, don't use your ATACMS to hit us deep in our territory, that will be a war directly between the US, because you will have programmed and armed and tracked the missiles, and us, and we are 2 nuclear superpowers. My kind of realism says, that's realistic. Take that seriously. Red lines are not to be tested, or stupid statements by American leaders that say, oh, don't fall for the bluff. I regard such statements as profoundly immature, profoundly incorrect, profoundly reckless, and profoundly unrealistic. Those are people trained in some classroom in game theory. They are not living real life, and they're not taking my life, but much more importantly, my children and my grandchildren's life seriously. They're playing a game. And they don't even know, well, they use the language of games, bluffs, signals, credibility, deterrence through escalation. These are game theory concepts in the nuclear age that are going to get us all killed 1 hour. By the way, it is going to be 1 hour.
20 minutes.
A nuclear war will end the world in about 2 hours, as a recent incredibly searing book by Annie Jacobson called Nuclear War, A Scenario, has laid out second by second. And we've got to do everything to prevent this. So when China says, don't meddle in our affairs with Taiwan, yes, good idea. When Russia says, don't put NATO right up against our borders, very good idea. When the United States says, don't put your military in the Caribbean or in Mexico, very good idea. The big powers should stay a little bit out of the way. It used to be the idea that buffer states or neutral states was a stabilizing approach for the world. At the end of World War II, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland, as you mentioned, formed a kind of buffer line that separated the Soviet sphere and the American sphere in Western Europe. It worked. It really worked. The idea that now it's so crucial for Sweden and Finland to join NATO, for Ukraine to join NATO, this is completely contrary to that idea. This is the idea that the United States has to press its nose right up against Russia. 2 nuclear powers, each with 6,000 nuclear warheads, as if this is a way that normal, rational people should behave. So my form of realism is, let's survive. That's realism for me.